Love is blind. That's what everyone told Clara from the moment she was old enough to understand heartbreak. Her mother said it, her teachers said it, every romance novel she ever hid under her pillow said it too. Love is blind, meaning it doesn't care what you look like, where you come from, or how many times the world has passed you over. Clara believed that. She believed it the way only someone who needed it to be true could believe something. But Clara would learn, on a cold night soaked in moonlight, with something large and breathing pressed against her bedroom window, that love wasn't blind at all. It had simply been looking at the wrong thing the entire time. And to understand what happened on that night, you have to understand what Clara's life looked like before him. Because this story doesn't start with a werewolf. It starts at a dinner table. The table sat 6. Only 3 of them ate most nights: Clara, her older sister Vivian, and their Aunt Meredith, who had raised them both since the accident that took their parents when Clara was 9 and Vivian was 12. Meredith was not a cruel woman. That's the thing people never understand about women like her. She wasn't cruel, she was just selective, with her warmth, with her attention, with the particular kind of softness that a girl needs from the person raising her. And Vivian received all of it. Vivian with her dark hair that curled perfectly without effort. Vivian with her laugh that filled every room she entered, the kind of laugh that made strangers turn their heads and smile without knowing why. Vivian, who had been engaged to Thomas Aldridge, son of the wealthiest family in Harrows Creek, for exactly 11 days, and whose engagement ring caught the candlelight at dinner every single night as if it, too, understood its audience. That particular evening, Meredith had made roast lamb, Vivian's favorite. She was mid-sentence, something about the Aldridge family's estate, something about the spring wedding, something about floral arrangements, when she reached across the table and touched Vivian's hand with a tenderness so automatic, it probably didn't even register as a choice. Clara watched it happen. She watched her aunt's face, the genuine, uncomplicated joy in it, and she felt something she had no clean name for. Not quite envy. Envy would have been simpler. This was more like standing outside a warm house in the middle of winter, pressing your palm flat against the glass, and understanding with complete clarity that you are outside, that you have always been outside, that nobody locked the door on purpose, which somehow makes it worse, not better. "Clara, love," Meredith said, without looking up from Vivian's ring, "would you clear the dishes?" Not, "Clara, what do you think?" Not, "Clara, are you all right?" Just, "Clara, would you clear the dishes?" And Clara stood, because she always stood, because that was the shape her life had taken, quietly, without ceremony, the girl who cleared up after the celebration. Here is what people didn't know about Clara Voss. She was, without question, the sharper of the 2 sisters. Not that anyone asked. She read everything she could find: history, medicine, folklore, maps of places she'd never been and half suspected she never would go. She noticed things, small things. The way Mrs. Henley at the market always weighed the good apples first and slipped the bruised ones underneath. The way Reverend Soane's left eye twitched fractionally whenever he said the word grace. The way animals went quiet sometimes, not the way animals go quiet before a storm, but a different kind of quiet, lower, more deliberate, like they were listening for something underneath the world. Clara noticed those things and filed them away, and never told anyone because nobody had ever given her the impression that what she noticed mattered. She had spent her whole life being almost enough, almost pretty enough. She had her mother's eyes, green and steady, but her face was soft where Vivienne's was striking, forgettable where Vivienne's was arresting. Almost charming enough, she could hold a conversation, make people laugh, but she never commanded a room the way her sister did without appearing to try. Almost loved enough. Meredith fed her, clothed her, kept her safe. But safety and love are not the same thing, and by the time Clara was 22, she knew the difference down to her bones. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It came in a cream envelope, the handwriting on the front elegant and deliberate, the kind of penmanship that suggested the writer had been taught it mattered, and it was addressed to Miss C. Voss. Clara stared at it for a full 10 seconds before she picked it up. Miss C. Voss. Her initial. Her name. She turned it over. The seal on the back was unfamiliar, a small pressed symbol she didn't recognize, circular, with something in the center she couldn't quite make out. She should have looked closer. She would think about that later, how she held the answer in her hands and almost saw it, and chose instead to feel hopeful, because that was what the letter felt like before she opened it. It felt like hope. It felt like the universe finally correcting a long-running error, an invitation, an acknowledgement, something for her. She sat down at the kitchen table, alone, and she opened it carefully. She read the first 3 lines, and then she read them again. Dear Miss C. Voss, we write on behalf of the Aldridge family regarding the upcoming spring celebration in honor of Miss Vivian Voss and Mr. Thomas Aldridge. The C was for Countess, a courtesy title prefix their mother's family had used on formal correspondence long before Clara was born. Someone had pulled an old address list. Someone had made a clerical error. It was Vivian's letter. It had always been Vivian's letter. Clara folded it back along its original crease, slowly, carefully, the way you handle something that has just become sharp, and she set it on the table in front of her. She sat there in the quiet kitchen for a moment, and then she got up and started on the dishes, because someone had to. She had spent her whole life being almost enough. She just didn't know yet that almost enough was exactly what someone was looking for. Chapter 1. The Almost Life. Harrow's Creek was the kind of town that looked beautiful in photographs: stone bridges over a narrow river, cobbled streets that caught the early morning light just right, window boxes full of wildflowers in summer, frost-laced and architectural in winter. The kind of place that made travelers slow their carriages and think, I could live here. I could be happy here. What the photographs didn't capture was the weight of it, the way everyone knew everyone, which sounds warm until you realize it means everyone also knew your business, your failures, your family history, and the precise ceiling the town had already decided you would never rise above. Harrow's Creek didn't punish ambition loudly. It just made the walls close in so gradually you didn't notice, until the day you tried to stretch and found you couldn't. Clara had stopped stretching at 19. She was 22 now, and she had built herself a life that fit inside the space she'd been given. She worked 3 mornings a week at the town's small lending library, cataloging returns and recommending books to people who rarely took her suggestions, and then came back 2 weeks later to tell her, with mild surprise, that the book had been wonderful. She kept the house, not because Meredith demanded it, but because it gave her days a shape, and shape was something she needed. She cooked well, quietly, without announcement. She walked the same route every evening, past the mill and along the river, because that particular stretch of water in that particular evening light was the one thing in Harrow's Creek that still felt like it belonged entirely to her. She did not have suitors. This was not something anyone said out loud. It was simply understood, the way many unkind things are understood in small towns, through implication, through the slight pause before a subject is changed, through the way Meredith's face arranged itself into careful neutrality whenever the topic edged too close. Vivian had been courted since she was 17, a steady procession of young men through the front parlor, each one reviewed and considered, and eventually either dismissed or entertained, depending on Meredith's assessment of their prospects. Thomas Aldridge had arrived 14 months ago and had not left, metaphorically speaking. He was attentive, financially solid, reasonably handsome in the way of men who have never had to develop personality as a backup option. Vivian liked him well enough. Meredith adored him completely. The engagement had been announced at dinner on a Thursday, and Meredith had actually wept. Soft, genuine tears that tracked down her face while she held Vivian's hands across the table. Clara had watched her aunt cry with real emotion for the first time she could remember. She had thought, so that's what it looks like. She'd excused herself to get more wine from the kitchen and stood there for a moment with her back against the cold stone wall, breathing slowly, talking herself down from something she refused to name. Then she'd picked up the bottle and walked back in with a steady hand and filled everyone's glass and said sincerely, "Congratulations, Viv. "He's a good man." Because he was. And because Clara was not the kind of person who poisoned other people's happiness just because her own cup was empty. That took more strength than anyone in that room would ever know. The suitor arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in early March. His name was Edmund Farley. He was 26, the second son of a wool merchant 2 towns over, and he arrived at the front door with his hat in his hands and the particular expression of a man who had been sent somewhere he did not entirely want to be. Meredith received him in the parlor with tea and a smile that was gracious but subtly assessing. Clara was introduced. Edmund looked at her with the eyes of someone mentally comparing a thing to a better version of that thing they had seen elsewhere. It took Clara approximately 4 minutes to understand the full architecture of the situation. Edmund Farley had come calling for Vivian first. His family had made quiet inquiries months ago, before Thomas Aldridge had solidified his position, before the engagement was formal. The Farley family had been politely redirected. And now, with Vivian no longer available, someone, she suspected Meredith, with the efficient pragmatism of a woman who managed things, had suggested that the younger Miss Voss was still quite unattached. Edmund was not unkind. That was the worst part of it, almost. He was not unkind. He was simply not there, not present in the way a man is present when he actually wants to be in a room. He asked her questions and listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone completing a task. He complimented her home. He mentioned twice that he enjoyed libraries. Clara answered everything politely. She poured his tea. She asked about his family's business with genuine interest because she was, by nature, a genuinely interested person, and watching someone's face when they talk about the thing they actually care about is one of the small mercies available to quiet people at uncomfortable social engagements. Edmund lit up briefly, talking about wool grades and regional trade routes. Clara thought, there is a real person in there, buried under all this obligation. She also thought, I will not be someone's obligation. When he left, after 40 minutes with the careful handshake of a man who had done his duty and was uncertain of the outcome, Meredith appeared in the doorway of the parlor with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and failing at the edges. He seemed pleasant, she said. He was, Clara agreed. She began stacking the teacups. His family has a solid business. The house in Denmere is quite... Aunt Meredith. Clara's voice was quiet, not sharp, just final. I'm not going to marry a man who came here because his first choice was already taken. Meredith was quiet for a moment, then, Clara, at some point... I know, Clara said. I know what you're going to say, and I understand why you're saying it, but no, not like this. She carried the tray to the kitchen. She stood at the sink and stared at the water running over the cups, and she let herself feel it, all of it, for exactly 60 seconds. The humiliation of it, the exhaustion of it, the particular specific grief of being 22 years old and already familiar with the taste of being someone's second thought. 60 seconds. Then she turned off the tap, dried her hands, and went back to the book she'd been reading before Edmund Farley arrived. She had her dignity. She had her mind. She had her river walk at dusk. She told herself that was enough. She almost believed it. It was on one of those river walks, 4 days later, that she first heard about the stranger. She was passing the bakery on her way back from the mill path when she heard old Petra, who was 73, partially deaf, and therefore conducted all conversations at a volume that ensured full neighborhood participation, talking to the butcher's wife through the open bakery window. Nobody knows him, Petra was saying. Came in from the North Road at dusk, just walking. No cart, no horse. Just walking like he had all the time in the world and none of it was owed to anyone. People pass through, the butcher's wife said, though she didn't sound convinced. People pass through, Petra agreed, and my Bram barks at every single one of them. Barked at the Aldridge boy the first 6 months he came courting. Barked at the tax collector. Barked at Father Hennessy on a Tuesday, God forgive him. A pause, waited. He didn't bark at this one. Clara had slowed down without meaning to. Not a sound, Petra continued. Bram sat down, just sat. Watched the man walk past like he was watching something that had the right to be there, like he already knew. The butcher's wife said something Clara couldn't hear. "Tall," Petra said. "Dark coat. Didn't look at any of us. But I'll tell you what, I watched him until he turned the corner by the inn, and the whole time—" She paused again, and Clara, standing still on the cobblestones with the early evening wrapping around her, felt the pause like a held breath. "The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd already been here before, that he knew exactly where he was going." Clara stood there another moment after Petra's voice moved on to other topics. She looked toward the end of the street, where the road curved past the inn and continued north toward the woodland that the locals didn't walk after dark. Not because of anything anyone could name specifically. There were no stories exactly, no legends with clean edges, just a general, inherited understanding that the forest on the north side of Harrow's Creek belonged to something other than the people of the town, and that the respectful thing was to behave accordingly. Clara had always thought that was superstition, the comfortable mythology of people who needed their fears to have an address. She thought about Bram, the baker's dog who barked at Father Hennessy on a Tuesday, sitting down in silence. She thought about the way animals went quiet sometimes. Not the way they go quiet before a storm. The other kind. The low, deliberate kind. Like they were listening for something underneath the world. She pulled her coat tighter and walked home. But she looked back once, at the corner by the inn, at the empty road that curved toward the tree line. And something in the base of her chest, something older than thought, something that lived below language, pulled tight like a drawn string and held. She didn't know what it meant. She would. Chapter 2. The Stranger with No Shadow of Fear. His name spread through Harrow's Creek the way all interesting things spread through small towns. Quietly, rapidly, and with the particular energy of people who would deny they were gossiping while actively gossiping. By Thursday morning, 2 days after Petra's conversation outside the bakery, Clara knew the following. His name was Dorian Ashvale. He had taken the largest room at the Harrow Inn, not the most expensive, but the one on the north-facing corner, which had a direct view of the woodland. He had paid a full month in advance, in cash, without being asked. He had declined Mrs. Orville's offer of the communal breakfast table and instead taken his coffee alone, standing at his window, which Mrs. Orville had reported to at least 6 people, with the breathless significance of someone delivering intelligence from a war front. He had also, apparently, smiled at her when he handed back the cup. And Mrs. Orville, who was 61 and had been widowed for 9 years and described herself as entirely beyond such things, had needed to sit down afterward. Clara heard all of this secondhand. She was not, by nature, a woman who sought out gossip. But in Harrow's Creek, you didn't have to seek it. It came to you, reliably, like weather. What she did not hear, what nobody seemed to be saying directly, though it hummed underneath every description like a low current, was anything concrete about who he was or where he had come from. People described him in detail. His height, the dark coat, the way he moved, unhurried, deliberate, with the ease of a man who had never once in his life needed to make himself smaller to fit a space. But when it came to origins, to purpose, to the ordinary biographical details that a town like Harrow's Creek consumed like bread, there was nothing. A name, a month's rent, a preference for corner rooms with northern views. That, in itself, was information. Clara filed it away and went to work. She met him on a Friday. The market ran every Friday morning along the main street. Farmers and craftspeople and the woman from 3 villages over who made the only decent cheese available within 20 miles. Clara went every week for the cheese, for the bread from the mill baker, and for the particular quality of solitude available in a crowd where everyone was too focused on their own purchasing to pay attention to you. She was examining a bolt of dark blue wool, not buying, just touching, the way you touch things you like but cannot justify, when she became aware that the market had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the texture of the crowd changed, the way a flock of birds will subtly reorient without any single bird appearing to lead. Conversations didn't stop, transactions continued. But something in the collective attention of Harrow's Creek Market moved, like iron filings responding to a magnet passing nearby. Clara didn't look up immediately. She kept her fingers on the wool and finished her assessment of it. Then she looked. He was moving through the market stalls with the particular patience of someone who had nowhere urgent to be and understood that as a privilege rather than a problem. He wasn't browsing exactly, more observing, taking stock of things with a quiet, methodical attention that reminded Clara, oddly, of the way she herself moved through the lending library. Like cataloging, like building a map. He was, she registered, exactly as advertised. Tall, dark coat, though a different one than Petra had described, charcoal gray today, well made, not new. A face that was not conventionally handsome in the way Thomas Aldridge was handsome, nothing symmetrical and comfortable about it. It was sharper than that, harder, the kind of face that asked something of you when you looked at it, that didn't allow for casual glancing. Strong jaw, dark eyes set slightly deep, the shadow of several days without shaving, a small scar above his left eyebrow, faint and old. What struck her most was his stillness. Even moving, he was still. Even in the middle of a crowded Friday market with noise and color and the smell of bread and animal and autumn air pressing in from every direction, he was contained in himself in a way that most people simply weren't. Like he occupied his own body completely, with nothing left over bleeding out into the space around him. Every person in the market was watching him without watching him. The careful, peripheral surveillance of a community encountering something it hasn't categorized yet. Clara turned back to the wool. She heard him stop behind her approximately 15 seconds later. Not close, 2 stalls down, looking at something at the herbalist's table. She didn't look again. She moved on to the bread stall. She was paying, counting coins into the baker's palm, when a voice, low and unhurried, spoke from just beside her. The sourdough, not the white. She turned. He was looking at the bread, not at her, with the mild, decisive air of someone who had an opinion and saw no reason not to share it. Then he did look at her, and for a fraction of a second something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, as if he had expected one thing and found another. "The white is better today," Clara said. "The sourdough sat overnight. You can tell by the crust, it's gone soft at the base." He looked at the sourdough. He looked back at her. "How do you know that?" "I come every week," she said simply. The baker, who had been watching this exchange with undisguised fascination, offered no input. The stranger, Dorian, looked at her for a moment with those deep-set dark eyes, and Clara held the look the way she held most things that made her slightly uncomfortable, steadily, without flinching, without performing ease she didn't feel. "The white, then," he said to the baker. He paid. He picked up the loaf, and then, instead of moving on, he remained where he was, half a step to her right, and said, "You're the only person in this market who hasn't stared at me." "I noticed you," Clara said. "There's a difference." Something crossed his face then, quick, genuine, unguarded, that was close to being moved. Not by flattery, because she hadn't flattered him, by accuracy, by being seen seeing him clearly, without pretense in either direction. "Dorian Ashvale," he said. "Clara Voss," she said. They stood there for a moment in the middle of Harrow's Creek Market on a Friday morning, with half the town pretending not to watch, and talked. Easily, naturally, with the disorienting comfort of two people discovering they speak the same private language without having agreed on it beforehand. He asked about the town with genuine curiosity, not the performative interest of a man being polite. She answered honestly, which meant including the parts that weren't charming. He laughed once, low, real, at something she said about the lending library's collection of agricultural manuals, which accounted for approximately 40% of the inventory and were checked out by absolutely nobody. It lasted maybe 12 minutes. It felt like stepping into warm light after a very long time in the cold. She thought about it more than she wanted to on the walk home. She thought about the way he'd looked at her, not the way men usually looked at Clara Voss, which was either the polite inattention of someone being courteous or the assessing gaze of someone running calculations. He had looked at her the way you look at something that surprises you, like she was a variable he hadn't accounted for. She found that she wanted to know what he'd accounted for instead. She found that wanting, and then she set it down carefully, the way you set down something fragile in a house with uneven floors. She was not a woman who could afford to build on unstable ground. She had learned that slowly, expensively, over 22 years of loving people who loved her back at partial capacity. She was still setting it down when she walked through the front door and found Meredith in the hallway, arranging dried flowers with the deliberate focus of a woman who had been waiting. "I heard you spoke to him," Meredith said without turning. Clara hung up her coat. "News travels." "In this town? Before you've reached the end of the street." Meredith set down a stem, still not turning. Then she did. Her face was composed. Warm, even. In the surface way, it was always warm. But her eyes were doing something different, something careful. "He's not from here, Clara." "I know. Men like that, they come through places like this. They take what they find interesting, and then they move on. That's what they do." A pause. "Don't get ahead of yourself, dear." Clara looked at her aunt, at the particular configuration of concern and dismissal that she had grown up reading like a second language, and she smiled. "I bought bread," she said. "I'll start dinner." She went to the kitchen. She did not tell Meredith that the conversation had lasted 12 minutes, and she already knew she wanted another one. Some things you keep in the part of yourself that belongs only to you. He found her on her evening walk 3 days later. Or perhaps she let herself be findable. She didn't examine that distinction too closely. He fell into step beside her along the mill path with the easy assurance of a man who was reasonably confident of his welcome and honest enough not to pretend otherwise. They walked and they talked, deeper this time, the second conversation depth that only happens between people who are already past the introductory phase, whether they meant to get there or not. She told him about her parents, briefly, carefully. He listened with his full attention, which was the kind of listening that made you want to keep talking because you believed, genuinely, physically believed, that every word was landing somewhere real. He told her very little about himself. She noticed that, filed it. What he gave her instead was presence, complete, unpartitioned, undistracted presence. And Clara, who had spent the better part of her life being the person in the room that the room forgot about, understood with a clarity that was almost painful exactly what that felt like to receive. It felt like oxygen. They reached the end of the mill path where it curved north toward the woodland, and without discussing it, they kept walking. The way you keep walking when a conversation is carrying you, and stopping would feel like breaking something. The trees began at a low stone wall, the old boundary marker, moss-covered and leaning. The woodland beyond it was dense, the light inside it already different, filtered, heavy, older somehow than the light in the open fields. Clara was mid-sentence when she felt it. Not heard it, felt it. Dorian stopped. Not slowed, stopped, as if someone had thrown a switch. One moment he was walking, warm and present beside her, and the next he was absolutely, completely still. And the stillness was different from his usual contained quiet. This was not composure. This was every muscle in his body pulling taut at once, every part of him orienting toward the tree line with an attention so acute it was almost audible. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been easy at his sides, closed slowly, fingers pressing into his palms. His eyes fixed on the darkness between the trees. Clara stopped talking. The silence lasted 4 seconds. 5. Long enough for the evening air to feel different against her skin, charged, thin, like the moment before lightning. Then he exhaled. His shoulders dropped a fraction. He turned back to her, and the smile that appeared was entirely natural, entirely easy, and arrived just a beat too quickly. "Sorry," he said. "Thought I heard something." Clara looked at his face, then she looked at the woodland. Then she looked back at him, at the smile that had come too fast, at the hands that were still not quite relaxed, at the eyes that held something she couldn't name. Not fear, because it wasn't fear. Something older than fear. Something that knew what was in those trees and was deciding in real time what to do about it. "It's getting dark," she said. "We should head back," he agreed. They turned and walked, and the conversation resumed, and he was warm and present again, every word landing somewhere real, exactly as before. But Clara's mind was quiet in the particular way it went quiet when it was working. She noticed things, small things. She filed them away. And something in the base of her chest, that old, wordless, pulled-tight thing, had not loosened since the moment he stopped at the tree line. It would not loosen for a long time. Something is already wrong with Dorian, and Clara can feel it too. Subscribe and hit the bell right now so you don't miss the moment she finally finds out what. Chapter 3. The Courtship and the Cage. The weeks that followed did not feel like falling. That was the thing Clara would return to later, when she was trying to understand how it had happened so completely without her noticing. Falling implies a moment of losing your footing, a specific instant you could point to and say, "There, that was where the ground gave way." What happened between her and Dorian Ashvale was nothing like that. It was more like the way a tide comes in, gradual, inevitable, and by the time you notice the water is at your waist, the shore is already far behind you. He did not court her the way men courted women in Harrow's Creek. There were no formal calls with hats in hand and conversation rationed into respectable portions. No flowers sent to the house, which would have required Meredith's acknowledgement, and Clara's subsequent navigation of her aunt's carefully neutral expression. No public gestures calibrated for the town's observation. What Dorian did was quieter than all of that, and it reached her in places those gestures never could have touched. He remembered everything, not in the performance of it, not the calculated recall of a man working to impress. He simply retained whatever she gave him, naturally and completely, the way a deep lake retains water. She mentioned once, briefly, that she'd been trying to find a specific history of the northern provinces that the library didn't carry. 3 days later, it appeared on the library's returns shelf, with a note in handwriting she recognized. "Found this at the inn. The innkeeper's previous tenant left it. Thought it should live somewhere it would be read." No signature, no expectation. She read it in 4 days and left it on the same shelf with a note of her own. Chapter 7 is wrong about the border dispute. Primary sources disagree. She added the sources. The next time she saw him, he had checked the sources. They discussed it for 40 minutes, standing outside the mill in the thin October sunlight, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, and Clara felt the specific electric pleasure of a mind meeting another mind at full capacity. No condescension, no performance, no one holding back to keep the conversation comfortable. Just two people thinking at full speed. She had not felt that in years. She had, if she was honest, never felt it quite like this. He showed up when she needed him before she knew she needed him. She still couldn't fully explain that. The logic of it refused to settle. The afternoon the roof of the wood store collapsed. Early November, a sudden weight of wet snow nobody had anticipated. She'd been in the back garden when it went, and the shock of it had buckled her knees and left her sitting in the snow with her ears ringing and her hands shaking, and no clear account of the previous 30 seconds. She was still sitting there, still trying to reassemble herself, when she heard the gate and looked up, and Dorian was crossing the garden toward her with the focused calm of someone who had not been summoned and did not require explanation. He didn't ask if she was all right. He could see she wasn't. He crouched down, checked her over with quick, efficient hands, looking for injury, not performing care, and when he confirmed she wasn't hurt, he simply sat down in the snow beside her and stayed there until her hands stopped shaking. "How did you know?" she asked eventually. He was quiet for a moment. "I was passing." She looked at him. The wood store was at the back of the property. The back of the property faced a lane that led nowhere except the mill, which was closed on Tuesdays. He had not been passing. There was nowhere to pass to. He held her look with steady, unreadable calm. She decided that afternoon to let it go. Everyone had things they didn't explain. She had hers. The privacy of a person's internal mechanics was something she respected in herself and extended to others, but she noted it, added it to the accumulation. Because there was an accumulation. She had started, without quite deciding to, keeping a kind of internal ledger, not of suspicions, she resisted that word, its implications, the shape it would force onto something she wasn't ready to define. More like observations. The particular data points that a mind like Clara's collected automatically when something didn't quite resolve. The canceled plans came first. 3 times in 1 month, the 4th, the 19th, and the 21st, he sent word that he couldn't meet her. Each time the excuse was different. Once, a prior obligation he couldn't describe in detail. Once, he wasn't feeling well, though he looked perfectly healthy when she saw him 2 days later, and he deflected the follow-up question so smoothly she almost didn't notice it had been deflected. The 3rd time, he simply said he needed to be elsewhere overnight and would explain when he could. She mapped the dates later, almost idly, against the almanac she kept for the garden. The 4th, the 19th, the 21st. She looked at the lunar calendar column. She closed the almanac and made tea and did not open it again for 2 weeks. The reflexes happened on a Wednesday. They were walking back from the Eastern Market, a longer route, a habit they'd fallen into because longer routes meant more time, when the cart horse broke free from its post outside the ironmonger's. It was a big animal, 17 hands at least, and it came around the corner at a full, panicked run, with an overturned cart screaming along the cobblestones behind it, straight down the narrow street, straight toward Clara, who had 1 second at most, and was already too close to the building on her left to move fast enough. She registered the sound. She registered the size of the animal. She registered, with the cold, specific clarity that extreme danger sometimes produces, that she was not going to get out of the way in time. And then Dorian's arm was around her waist, and she was against the wall on the other side of the street, and the horse and cart were past them, already 20 feet away, still running. She stood with her back against the stone wall, and her heart slamming against her ribs, and looked at him. He was breathing normally. His hand, still at her waist, was steady. He looked mildly alert, the way a person looks after a near miss, not the way a person looks after moving faster than any human being she had ever seen move. Not a tremor, not the adrenaline flush that should have been flooding his face. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. She looked down at the cobblestones. The distance between where she had been standing and where she now stood against the wall was at least 8 feet. He had covered that distance. In the time it had taken the cart to pass, while she had been unable to take a single step. She looked back at his face. He was watching her with that particular expression she had started to recognize, the one that was completely composed and present and gave absolutely nothing away underneath. "Good," he said, and released her gently, and they continued walking, and the conversation resumed, and he was warm and steady beside her every step of the way home. She thought about those 8 feet for 3 days. The dinner was Meredith's idea, a gesture of social acknowledgement, grudging and precise, that communicated she had accepted Dorian's presence in Clara's life without endorsing it. She cooked well. The table was properly set. Vivian came because Vivian lived there, and because refusing would have required more honesty about her feelings than she was prepared to offer. Meredith served lamb. Clara watched Dorian look at the meat with an expression she could not categorize. Not disgust, nothing that simple. More like a man encountering something his body was registering one way, while his mind was overriding it in the other direction. His jaw was set. He transferred a piece to his plate and cut it and rearranged it with the skilled casualness of someone who had done this before, made a full plate look eaten without eating it, and Clara, who noticed small things, watched every movement of his cutlery and said nothing. She had seen that expression on his face one other time, outside the butcher's shop the previous week. She'd been a few steps ahead of him and had turned back to say something and caught him stopped on the pavement, looking through the butcher's window with an expression that lived in no category she had a name for. Not hunger in any ordinary sense, something rawer than that. something that came from a place in him that the composed, careful, warm man she spent her evenings with was working very hard to keep behind a closed door. He had felt her looking, and it was gone instantly, replaced with his usual self, and he had smiled and caught up with her and asked what she'd been about to say. She told him. He answered. They walked on. She kept the image of his face at the butcher's window the way she kept all the other images, privately, carefully, without yet assembling them into a conclusion she wasn't ready to reach. The picnic happened on a rare, warm afternoon in late November, one of those borrowed days that appear occasionally at the wrong time of year, like an apology from the season. They walked further than usual, out to the flat meadow on the south side of the mill, where the grass was still dry and the light came in low and golden and unobstructed. Clara had brought bread and cheese and 2 apples and a book she didn't end up reading. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, in the middle of a conversation about river systems and their effect on regional trade patterns, Dorian simply lay back in the grass and closed his eyes, not dramatically, not as a gesture. He was tired. She had begun to notice he slept poorly, that there were mornings he arrived looking like a man who had spent the night negotiating with something, and the sun was warm and he was comfortable, and he let himself rest. Clara sat beside him and watched his face go quiet. She watched the work leave it, watched the careful composure ease off, feature by feature, until what remained was something younger and less armored and more real than anything he showed the waking world. The scar above his left eyebrow caught the light. The line of his jaw softened slightly. His breathing deepened and slowed. His face turned instinctively toward the sun. She looked at his hands. Even completely relaxed, even in sleep, his fingers were not fully open. They curved slightly, not fisted, not tense, just curved, like they were holding the memory of a grip, like some part of him, even unconscious, was braced, waiting, maintaining a readiness that never entirely released. She sat with that for a long time. Everyone has secrets, she told herself. You have yours. She thought of the letter she'd never sent to the one friend who'd moved away, the one where she'd written out everything she felt about her life in this town and then burned it page by page because some truths feel too naked to survive being read. She thought of the 3 times she had stood at her bedroom window at night, looking at the mill path, and admitted to herself, in the dark where it didn't count, that she was more afraid of never being chosen than she was of anything else in the world. She had secrets. Everyone did. The presence of a locked door did not mean what was behind it was dangerous. She looked at his sleeping face. She looked at his hands. Everyone has secrets, she told herself again, and she almost believed it. Vivian made her move on a Thursday. In fairness, and Clara was always, even when she didn't want to be, fair, Vivian probably didn't think of it as a move. Vivian didn't strategize the way smaller people did. She simply existed at full brightness and let the gravitational consequences sort themselves out. She had Thomas, who adored her, who was building her a life. She didn't want Dorian, but she wanted to confirm she could have him if she decided to. Clara saw it from across the room at the Aldridge pre-wedding gathering, Vivian turning the full force of herself toward Dorian in a corner of the parlor, her laugh pitched perfectly, her hand placed briefly and meaningfully on his arm. Dorian received it with the courteous ease of a man who was not unaware of what was happening and had decided to let it run its course without feeding it. He was polite, warm enough not to be rude, present enough to satisfy the social requirement, and then, with a naturalness that couldn't have been performed because performance always has a seam, he simply turned and found Clara across the room and crossed to her, and the quality of his attention, the particular weight and completeness of it, shifted in a way that was instantly, unmistakably different from how he had been looking at Vivian. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't need to. Clara felt it like sunlight on the specific part of her chest that had been in shadow for years. They left together 20 minutes later, stepping out into the cold night air, their shoulders close. Behind them, through the warm window, Clara could see Vivian watching. She expected envy. She was familiar with the shape of Vivian's envy, quick, hot, dissolving fast into something else. This was not that. Vivian's face was still. Her eyes tracked them through the glass with an expression that was slower than envy and colder and carried something in it that Clara, who noticed everything, could not immediately name. Then Vivian turned away, and Clara heard, or perhaps felt, the way you sometimes feel words spoken quietly at a distance when the night air is still enough. Her sister's voice, directed at no one, barely above a breath. "You don't know what you're inviting in." Clara kept walking. She kept her face forward and her steps even and her breathing steady. But the words followed her all the way home, quiet and persistent, like a sound that begins below the threshold of hearing and works its way up until you can't pretend anymore that the house is silent. You don't know what you're inviting in. She knew Vivian. She knew the architecture of her sister's cruelty, the precise placement, the timing, the specific vulnerabilities targeted. This hadn't felt like cruelty, it had felt like warning. And Clara, who noticed things, who filed things away, who had been building a quiet and careful ledger of observations she wasn't yet ready to name, lay awake that night until the moon moved past her window. And for the first time, she was afraid of what she was starting to know. Chapter 4. The Proposal. She had told him about her parents on a night in October, almost by accident. They had been sitting on the low stone wall behind the library, after closing, in the dark, sharing the last of a bottle of cider she'd found in the back room, and he'd produced 2 cups from somewhere without explanation. And the conversation had moved the way conversations move when the hour is late and the cold keeps everything honest. From small things to larger things, from the surface down. She hadn't planned to talk about them, she almost never did. Her parents existed in her in the way of deep water, present, formative, rarely visible from the surface unless you knew where to look. But Dorian had asked about the books on the top shelf of the library, the ones she kept there specifically because the height made them difficult for casual browsers, and she'd explained they were her mother's. Her mother had believed that the best books should require a little effort to reach, that anything worth having should ask something of you first. And then, because he was listening the way he always listened, completely, with his full and unhurried self, she had kept going. Her mother had been a schoolteacher. Her father had repaired clocks. They had been, by any external measure, an unremarkable couple in an unremarkable town. No money, no status, no particular claim on the world's attention. But they had loved each other with a consistency and a depth that Clara, even as a child, had recognized as rare. Not the dramatic love of stories, the daily kind, the kind that shows up, the kind that says, "I see the whole of you and I'm not going anywhere," not once in a grand gesture, but 10,000 times in small ones, over years, until it becomes the structure the rest of life is built on. Her father had said once that love wasn't something you fell into, it was something you built, deliberately, with someone who showed up to the construction every day. Her mother had said the measure of love wasn't how you felt on the best days, it was what you did on the days when feeling had nothing to do with it. Clara had told Dorian all of this in the dark behind the library, her voice quiet, her hands wrapped around her cup of cider, looking at the middle distance. She hadn't looked at him while she spoke. Some things are easier to say to the dark. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "They sound like people who understood something most people spend their whole lives missing." "They did," she said, "and then they were gone. And I've been looking for evidence that what they had was real ever since." She heard herself say it and felt the exposure of it, the rawness of having handed something true to another person without the protection of distance or irony. She finally looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she had no name for. Not pity. She would have closed down immediately at pity. Not sympathy in the soft, careful way that kept the other person at arm's length. Something more direct than either, like he had just understood something important and was deciding what to do with it. "It was real," he said simply. "You know it was. That's why you're still looking." She had not had an answer for that. She had looked back at the dark and finished her cider, and they had sat in companionable silence until the cold made staying impractical. She had thought about those words for weeks. He proposed on a Tuesday evening in the first week of December. He had asked her, that afternoon, to walk to the South Meadow, the same one where he had slept in the late November sun, and she had watched his hands stay curled even in rest. She had agreed without reading anything particular into it. They walked there often. It was their place in the specific, unspoken way that places between two people become theirs, not claimed, just recognized. The light was already going when they arrived. December dusk in Harrow's Creek came fast and blue, and the meadow in that light had a quality that was almost suspended. The grass silver gray, the tree line dark at the edges, the sky above them enormous and cold and entirely clear. Dorian stopped in the middle of the meadow. He turned to face her, and she knew immediately, not from any single thing, but from the particular quality of his stillness, which was different from his usual contained quiet. This was not composure. This was a man standing completely still because he was holding something large and needed his whole body to do it. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out something small. Not a box, just a ring, held between his fingers. Simple. Old. A dark stone she didn't recognize set in silver that had gone warm gray with age. The kind of ring that had belonged to someone before. "This was my grandmother's," he said. "She wore it for 51 years. She told me once that the man who gave it to her was the first person who ever saw her clearly. All of her. The parts she offered and the parts she hid, and stayed anyway. She said that was the only kind of love worth building a life on." Clara's chest had gone very still. "You told me your father said love was something you built deliberately, every day, with someone who showed up to the construction." He held her gaze. "I've been showing up, Clara. I intend to keep showing up, every day with everything I have." A pause. "I know I have things I haven't told you yet. I know there are parts of me you haven't seen. I'm asking you to let me show you, properly, all of it, as your husband, because I want to build this with you, the daily kind, the kind that shows up." He had taken her words, her mother's words, her father's words. He had held them for 2 months and brought them back to her built into a foundation. Clara stood in the December meadow with the blue dusk coming down around them and looked at this man. This complicated, quiet, extraordinary man with his old ring and his careful secrets and his hands that curled even in sleep, and she felt the ground under her feet as solid as it had ever been. "Yes," she said, not breathlessly, not with the dramatic collapse of a woman who has been waiting to be chosen. Steadily, clearly, the way her mother would have said it, she thought, like a woman who had assessed the full weight of a thing and was lifting it anyway because she judged it worth the effort. He put the ring on her finger. It fit as though it had been made for her. She thought later that she should have paid more attention to that detail. The town found out by Wednesday morning. Clara had not announced it. She had gone home the evening before with the ring on her finger and told Meredith directly, not asking permission, not softening it, just stating it plainly while she hung up her coat. Meredith had looked at the ring for a long moment, then at Clara's face, then said, "I see," which was neither congratulations nor objection, and covered nothing and everything simultaneously. But Harrow's Creek did not require announcement. It required only proximity to anyone who had seen the ring, and by the time Clara reached the market Wednesday morning, the news had arrived before her. The reactions were instructive. Mrs. Orville from the inn offered a warm embrace and said Dorian was a lovely man and that the corner room had good light and she hoped they'd stay in town. It was genuine. It was also very slightly too quick, the warmth dialed up a fraction past natural, the way people perform enthusiasm when the alternative would require them to name a feeling they can't justify. Thomas Aldridge shook her hand and said, "Congratulations," with the easy confidence of a man who had never had cause to think carefully about what lurked at the edges of things. The innkeeper, gray-haired, quiet Mr. Callow, who had been running the Harrow Inn for 30 years and had seen everything the North Road could deliver, clapped Dorian on the back when he passed. Clara watched it happen from across the street. The congratulation was real, but the hand came down a beat late, like his body had agreed to the gesture before his instincts had quite finished their deliberation. She was cataloging this, adding it to the ledger quietly behind everything else, when she passed the old blacksmith's forge at the end of the market lane. Gideon Marsh was 70 years old and had been shoeing horses and mending iron for 50 of them. He was not a man given to stillness. He was always working, always moving, the forge always lit. She glanced through the open forge door as she passed and saw him standing motionless at his work table, a horseshoe held loosely in one hand, staring at the middle distance with an expression of profound and private weight. The forge fire was burning. He wasn't working. He was simply standing there, very still, as if news had reached him and he was deciding what to do with what it meant. He didn't see her looking. She kept walking. The old herb woman caught her wrist at the end of the market. Her name was Isadora. She had a stall at the far corner, year-round, regardless of weather. Dried bundles of things Clara could only partially identify, small stoppered bottles, sachets that smelled of something beneath their surface ingredients, something older and more mineral. Clara had bought lavender from her once. She had always felt, in Isadora's proximity, the mild discomfort of being read by someone who hadn't asked permission. The hand on her wrist was dry and very strong. "Miss Voss?" Clara turned. Isadora was looking at her with eyes that were clear and direct and deeply, specifically serious. "I've heard the news," the old woman said. She didn't congratulate her. "Before you give him your name, ask him what he is." Clara kept her expression neutral with some effort. "I'm sorry?" "Your name, given in marriage, is not a small thing." Isadora's grip didn't loosen. In certain arrangements, in certain bloodlines, a name given is a name bound. It becomes a thread. It connects you in ways that cannot be undone simply because you later change your mind. Her eyes didn't move from Clara's face. "Ask him what he is." Before. The market noise continued around them. Someone was haggling over the price of winter root vegetables. A child was crying 2 stalls over. The world was proceeding with its ordinary business, and here was this old woman with her dry iron grip and her clear, serious eyes, saying something that sat between superstition and warning in a way Clara could not cleanly categorize. She pulled her wrist back gently. She laughed. A small sound, genuine enough to pass, reflexive in the way that laughter sometimes is when the alternative is standing in the middle of a market lane, taking seriously something you are not prepared to take seriously. "Thank you, Isadora," she said. "I'll keep that in mind." She walked away at a normal pace. She did not look back. But the grip on her wrist, the precise memory of its pressure, stayed with her through the afternoon with the persistence of things that the body records separately from the mind. And the words followed her in the way Vivian's words had followed her home through the cold night air. A name given is a name bound. She thought about Dorian's grandmother's ring. 51 years. The first person who ever saw her clearly, all of her, and stayed anyway. She thought about what it meant to give a name, what it meant to be bound. She told herself, old women in market stalls say old things. Folklore and caution dressed up as wisdom. It meant nothing specific. It was not directed at anything real. She had almost finished convincing herself of this by the time the wedding date was set, 1 month away. He held her that night in the doorway of the library, after closing, after the town had gone quiet around them, and the cold had settled into the stones, and the dark was complete. She had her head against his chest, and his arms were around her, and she could feel the steady weight of him, the warmth that was always slightly more than ordinary, the heartbeat that was slow and deep and even, the quality of held stillness that was simply native to him, like a geographical feature. She felt safe. That was the specific, devastating thing. She felt safe, in a way she hadn't felt since she was 8 years old, and her parents were still alive, and the world was still the size of a house where love came easily. He spoke quietly into her hair. "I need you to know something." She waited. "Whatever you learn about me, in time, whenever that comes, I need you to know that what I feel for you is real. A pause, long enough to have weight. Everything else. There are things I should have told you, things I will tell you, but that part, what I feel, that was never a lie. That part was never a strategy or a convenience or anything other than exactly what it is. She lifted her head and looked at him. His face in the dark was open in the way it almost never was. The careful composure set down, the locked doors briefly unlocked, something behind his eyes that was unguarded and earnest and slightly afraid. I know, she said, because she did. Whatever else she didn't know, and the ledger was long, the accumulation was real, she knew that. She had always known that. He held her tighter. She let him. She thought, he is telling me something. Underneath the words, he is telling me something important. She thought, I am choosing not to ask what it is. Not yet. She thought, 1 month. And she pushed the ledger, all the entries, all the careful, quiet observations, to the back of her mind, and let herself stand in the warmth of him for just a little longer. What she did not yet understand was this. When a man like Dorian Ashvale tells you that what he feels is real, before you have asked, without prompting, with that specific quality of urgency and weight in his voice, he is not being romantic. He is preparing you. And the difference between those two things would become the most important thing Clara Voss had ever failed to understand in time. Chapter 5. The Wedding and What Hid Beneath the Vows. The morning of the wedding came in cold and absolutely clear. No clouds, no wind. Just a hard blue December sky stretched tight over Harrow's Creek, like something had ironed it flat, and a frost so precise it had silvered every surface, every cobblestone, every window ledge, every bare branch of every tree, with a thin, bright layer that caught the early light and held it. Clara stood at her bedroom window at 6 in the morning and looked at it. She had slept, surprisingly. Not well and not long, but she had slept, which she considered an achievement, given that the night before a wedding is when every doubt a person has ever entertained tends to arrive simultaneously and demand attention. She had expected that. She had prepared for it. She had sat with her doubts the way she sat with difficult books, carefully, without flinching, reading all the way to the end before forming a conclusion. And the conclusion, reached somewhere around 2 in the morning with the frost building outside and the house quiet around her, was the same one she had reached in the December meadow when he put his grandmother's ring on her finger. She trusted him. Not blindly. She had never done anything blindly in her life, and she was not about to start. She trusted him the way you trust a deep river, with full awareness that there was more beneath the surface than you could see, and with a judgment that the depth was not the same as danger. He had secrets. She had accepted that. What she had not accepted and would not accept was the idea that the man who had shown up in her garden without being called, who had brought her the book she'd been looking for, who had taken her parents' words about love and built a proposal from them, that man was something to run from. She had made her decision. She dressed carefully, without ceremony. The ceremony was held at the small stone chapel at the end of Market Lane, the oldest building in Harrow's Creek, its walls thick enough to hold the cold out entirely, its interior lit that morning by candles that the Reverend's wife had arranged along every available surface, until the chapel glowed amber and warm against the December morning outside. Clara walked in on her own. She had considered asking Thomas Aldridge, Vivian's fiancé, the most socially appropriate option, but the thought of being escorted down the aisle by someone performing a courtesy felt exactly like the kind of thing she had spent her life refusing. She had arrived in this relationship under her own power. She would arrive at the altar the same way. The chapel was not full. She hadn't wanted full. A small gathering, Mrs. Orville, the library director and his wife, 2 women she had known since childhood, Meredith seated in the front row in her best gray dress with an expression of composed ambivalence, Vivian beside her in a dark blue coat, her engagement ring catching the candlelight with its usual reliability, and Dorian's family seated on the right, 3 of them. Clara had known they were coming, Dorian had told her briefly that his family would travel from the north. He had offered very little additional detail, and she had not pushed, filing the absence of detail in the same place she filed everything else. But nothing he could have said would have fully prepared her for the specific quality of their presence in the chapel. They were striking in the way that Dorian was striking, not conventional beauty, but something more fundamental than that. A completeness of physical presence that most people simply didn't have. The oldest of the three was a man of perhaps 50, gray at the temples, with Dorian's deep-set eyes and a stillness so absolute he might have been carved. Beside him sat a woman of similar age, composed, watchful, with the particular quality of someone who processes information faster than they let on. And at the end of the pew, a younger woman, late 20s, dark-haired, with a directness in her expression that Clara recognized as the family trait it apparently was. They watched Clara walk down the aisle, not rudely, not with any hostility, but with an attention that was different from the attention of wedding guests. It was the attention of people who were assessing something important, running a calculation, arriving at conclusions with quiet speed. The older man's eyes moved from Clara's face to Dorian's and back, and something in his expression settled, barely perceptibly, a fraction of tension releasing, as if a question he had been holding had just been answered to his satisfaction. Clara filed all of it and kept walking. Dorian was waiting at the altar. She had seen him in his good coat before. She had seen him clean and carefully dressed for Meredith's dinner, for the Aldridge gathering, for every occasion that called for his better self presented to the world. But she had not seen him like this, standing at the altar of the old stone chapel, with the candles burning gold around him, and his face turned toward her as she walked down the aisle, and something in his expression that was so completely unguarded, it stopped her breath for a step. He looked at her the way she had always wanted to be looked at. Not like she was beautiful, though his eyes said that too, plainly, without performance. Like she was significant. Like her arrival in this specific room at this specific moment was the most important thing that had happened in a very long time, and he knew it, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. She reached him. He took her hands. His were warm, always warm, that slight excess of warmth she had stopped questioning, and steady, and he held hers with a care that was neither fragile nor performative, just sure, like holding something he intended to keep. The Reverend began. Clara heard the words from a slight distance, the way you hear things when your attention is fully occupied elsewhere. She was looking at Dorian's face. She was looking at the small scar above his left eyebrow, and the dark eyes that held hers without looking away, and the set of his jaw that had always reminded her of a man bracing against something. And she was thinking, I don't have all of you yet. I know that. But I'm going to. When it came time for the vows, Dorian had written his own. The Reverend had mentioned it beforehand, slightly awkwardly in the way of a man who had been presented with an unusual request and had decided that unusual was not the same as inappropriate. Clara had known. She had written her own in return 3 nights ago, sitting at the kitchen table after midnight with the house asleep around her. He spoke without notes. His voice was quiet and level, the same voice he used for everything, unhurried, with that slight depth that she had come to understand was simply how he was built. The chapel was completely silent. Even the candles seemed to hold still. Clara. Just her name first, just that. I give you my loyalty, above all instinct. A pause, the weight of it settling. I give you my protection, even against what lives inside me. Clara felt something move through the chapel, not sound, not wind, something more interior than either, a shift in the quality of the silence, as if the words had displaced something in the air. She saw, in her peripheral vision, the older man on the right side of the chapel go very still. Stiller than he had already been, which was saying something. I give you my truth, when you are ready to hold it. He looked at her with those deep-set dark eyes, and in them she saw everything she had always seen, the warmth, the steadiness, the complete and unhurried attention, And underneath it, running like a current beneath still water, something vast and old and not entirely domesticated. I give you the man I choose to be, every day for the rest of our lives, and I ask only that you let me become him, fully, beside you. He stopped. The silence held for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Clara was crying. She hadn't decided to. She became aware of it the way you become aware of rain. By the time you notice it, it has already been happening. She said her own vows, the ones she had written at midnight, about the daily kind of love, about construction and showing up, about choosing someone not once, but continuously. Her voice was steady, her hands in his were steady, but some part of her mind, the part that filed things away, the part that never fully went quiet, was still holding his words, above all instinct. Against what lives inside me. When you are ready to hold it. Not if, when. She looked at his face and he looked back at hers and she thought, he is telling me. Right now, in front of everyone, he is telling me exactly what he is and exactly what this costs him and exactly what he is asking of me. And she had said yes. She was saying yes still, even now, ring on her finger, his hands holding hers, standing in the amber light of the old stone chapel. She pushed the analysis to the back of her mind. She let herself be a woman getting married. Just for now. Just for today. The reception was held at the inn. Mrs. Orville had outdone herself in the way of women who take hospitality personally. The long table was extraordinary, the fire was enormous, the whole room smelled of pine and cider and roasted things. People moved through it with the particular warmth of a winter celebration, the cold outside making the warmth inside feel like something earned. Dorian moved through the room with her at his side, and the quality of him in a social gathering was something she still found quietly remarkable. He spoke to everyone, not with the effortful charm of someone performing engagement, but with genuine, specific interest in each person, asking Mrs. Orville about the renovation she'd been planning for 2 years, asking the library director about a book acquisition he'd mentioned in passing 3 weeks ago. He remembered everything about everyone. He made people feel uniformly like they were worth remembering. She watched Harrow's Creek warm to him with only the faintest, finest thread of reservation running underneath it. That quality she had first noticed in Mr. Callow's delayed congratulation, in Gideon Marsh's stillness at the forge. Not distrust exactly, more like the behavior of people who had an old and wordless understanding that some things required a particular kind of care, and who were deciding, community by community, that Dorian Ashvale with Clara Voss was a thing they would sanction while remaining quietly, indefinitely alert. She found she didn't have the emotional resources on her wedding day to examine that too closely. His family found her separately. The older man, Dorian's uncle, she had gathered, though the specifics of the family structure had remained vague, shook her hand with a grip that was measured and deliberate, and said, "You are exactly what he described." Which was not quite a compliment and not quite an assessment and contained in its precision something she couldn't immediately decode. The older woman kissed her cheek, looked at her face for a moment too long, and said nothing at all. Her silence had weight and shape, and Clara had the distinct impression that what she was leaving unsaid was not from absence of thought, but from a decision that now was not the time. The younger woman, Dorian's cousin, she had learned her name was Sarah, waited until the others had moved away. She was perhaps 3 years older than Clara, with the same dark eyes as the family, and a directness that had none of Dorian's careful management. She simply said what she thought, apparently, which Clara found both alarming and deeply refreshing. Sarah hugged her, a real one, the kind that has actual pressure behind it. And then she kept her hands on Clara's arms and held her at slight distance and looked at her face with those dark, direct eyes and said, quietly enough that no one else could hear, "He chose you on purpose." Clara waited. Not because you were available, not because of anything about your family or your name or your circumstances. Sarah's hands were firm and warm on her arms. "He came to this town because of you specifically. I need you to know that. Whatever else comes, And things will come, Clara. I won't lie to you about that. The choosing was real. It was deliberate. It was him, in full knowledge of everything, deciding. She looked at Clara for one more moment, long enough to confirm the words had landed, and then released her arms and stepped back and smiled and said, at normal volume, "Welcome to the family. We are a lot, but we are loyal to the bone." And she walked back toward the fire. Clara stood where she was for a moment. He chose you on purpose. He came to this town because of you specifically. She turned the words over. On one side, the warmth of them, the radical, unfamiliar warmth of being told that someone had chosen her first, deliberately, with their full self. On the other side, the thing Sarah had said so carefully, with those steady eyes, with that measured deliberateness. Whatever else comes, things will come. Not, I hope things go smoothly. Not, marriage is hard sometimes, but you'll be fine. Things will come. Like a woman who knew exactly what was coming and had decided that full warning, delivered now, was the most loving thing she could offer. Clara looked across the room at Dorian, who was laughing at something the Reverend had said, genuine laughter, unguarded, the rarest version of him, and she felt the love for him move through her chest like a tide. She also felt, running underneath it, cold and specific and no longer deniable. He came here for me. He knew who I was before we met, which means the meeting was not an accident, which means nothing about this began the way I thought it did. She crossed the room to stand beside him. He put his arm around her immediately, naturally, without looking, the reflex of a man who always knew exactly where she was. She leaned into him. She smiled. She stayed. But the thought had taken root now, down in the dark where thoughts go when you're not ready to look at them directly, and it was already growing. Later, when the guests had gone and the fire had burned low and the inn was quiet, she lay awake beside him in the dark. He was asleep. She could tell by his breathing, that deep, slow pattern, face toward the ceiling, fingers curled slightly even in rest. She looked at the shape of him in the dark, and she thought about his vows. She thought about Sarah's hands on her arms. She thought about Isadora's grip on her wrist at the market. Ask him what he is before you give him your name. A name given is a name bound. She looked at her hand in the dark. The old ring, the dark stone, the silver gone warm gray with 51 years of a woman's life. She was Clara Ashvale now. She had given him her name. She fell asleep before she could decide what she thought about that. And outside, at the edge of the woodland that faced the northern corner of the inn, something that lived between the trees was still and watchful in the dark, and had been since the ceremony ended, and the full moon was 19 days away. His own vows were hiding the truth in plain sight, and nobody caught it. Did you catch it? Tell me in the comments what line gave you chills. Like this video if the wedding scene hit different than you expected. Chapter 6. Married Life and the Room She Wasn't Supposed to Find. Marriage, Clara discovered, had a texture she hadn't anticipated. Not the grand emotional texture, she had prepared for that, had thought carefully about what it would mean to share her life with another person, had read enough and observed enough to know that intimacy was rarely comfortable in the ways people promised, and frequently profound in the ways they didn't mention. She had prepared for the large things. It was the small things that undid her. In the best possible way. The way he made coffee in the morning before she was fully awake and left it on the side of the stove where the residual heat would keep it warm, but not cook it further, because she had mentioned once, in passing, that she preferred coffee that had rested rather than coffee still actively boiling. The way he moved through their shared space with a natural awareness of where she was, adjusting his trajectory around her without looking, like they had been navigating the same rooms for years rather than weeks. The way he read beside her in the evenings, not talking, not performing companionship, just present in the particular quality that was native to him, that complete and unhurried occupying of space, and occasionally looked up and said something about whatever he was reading that was so precisely the kind of thing she would have thought that she sometimes forgot to respond because she was too busy registering the specific pleasure of being known. He was, in the daily life of it, extraordinary. Not in the manner of men who perform consideration, who do the visible, creditable things and consider the account settled. In the manner of someone for whom attention was simply how he was built. He noticed what she needed before she articulated it. He gave her solitude when solitude was what the day required, and presence when presence was what it required. And he seemed to understand the difference without her having to explain it, which was the rarest thing she had ever encountered in another person. She loved him. She had known it for weeks before the wedding, and she had not said it yet, not in those exact words. They had not been people who said things before they were sure, either of them. But it was there, fully formed and undeniable, living in her chest with the solidity of something that had been true for longer than she'd been paying attention. She loved him, and their life together was tender and real, and for stretches of days at a time, she could simply be inside it without the cold current underneath surfacing. But it always surfaced. The house Dorian had rented, larger than she would have chosen, older, stone-built at the edge of town where the residential lane gave way to open land, had 6 rooms on the ground floor and 4 above. They used perhaps half of them with any regularity. The east wing, which jutted from the main body of the house at a slight angle that suggested it had been added by a different builder in a different century, was largely closed off. Cold, Dorian had said when she'd asked about it early on. Poor insulation. They'd get to it in spring. Clara had accepted this without particular thought. Old houses were full of impractical spaces. She had not gone looking. The door was simply ajar on a Tuesday morning in January. She was passing through the east corridor with clean linens for the spare room, a task so ordinary it had its own specific rhythm, the weight of the bundle, the smell of dried lavender she tucked between the folds. When she registered in her peripheral vision, the door at the end of the corridor standing open approximately 4 inches. She had passed that door dozens of times. It was always shut. Always, without exception. She stopped. She stood in the corridor for a moment with the linens in her arms and the pale January light coming through the window at her back. And she looked at that 4-inch gap of darkness, and she felt the pulled-tight feeling in her chest, the old, wordless, below-language sensation, activate with a precision that was almost physical. She should have kept walking. She knew, even then, standing in the corridor, that she should keep walking. That some doors are ajar for reasons, and some doors are ajar by accident, and that the right move, the safe move, the move that preserved the life she was building, was to leave it until Dorian came home and mention it to him over dinner. She stood there for approximately 10 seconds. Then she pushed the door open. The room was not large. Stone walls, the original construction, older than the rest of the house, the mortar between the blocks dark with age and moisture. A single high window, small and north-facing, that let in light of the particular gray, directionless quality of light that has never touched anything warm. A stone floor, swept clean. No furniture, no shelves, nothing stored, no trunks or covered shapes or any of the ordinary debris of an unused room. Just the walls. And the marks on them. She saw them as her eyes adjusted, first on the wall directly opposite the door, then on the wall to her left, then, when she turned, on the wall behind her. Long gouges in the stone, deep enough that the lighter rock beneath the surface was exposed in bright, raw lines. Parallel. Always parallel. Always. She counted automatically because she always counted, because her mind organized things whether she wanted it to or not, in sets of 5. 5 lines, spaced at the width of a spread hand. She stood very still. The wall to her left had more. Lower down, closer to the floor, where the stone met the flagging, a concentration of them there, grouped and overlapping, as if whatever had made them had been lower, crouching, pressing harder. The rock in that area was not just gouged, but fractured slightly, small wedges displaced from the wall and lying in the dust below. She made herself look at all of it, made herself stand there and look with clear eyes instead of the blurred vision of someone who has decided not to see. Then she saw the chain. It was bolted to the floor in the center of the room, not decoratively, not historically. This was not old iron left from some previous purpose. The bolt was recent. The metal was dark but not corroded, the fixings countersunk into the stone with careful, deliberate work. Someone had put this here on purpose, with forethought, with the right tools and enough time to do it properly. The chain was thick. She crossed the room and crouched beside it, and looked at the links with the same clear eyes she had used on the walls. Each link was as wide across as her thumb. The steel was heavy and dark, and the engineering of it communicated, plainly and without ambiguity, that it had been made to hold something with significant strength. 2 links near the middle of the chain were bent, not broken, not corroded through. Bent, deformed laterally, the metal itself compressed and distorted on one side, the way metal deforms when force is applied to it that exceeds what it was rated for. Whatever had been held by this chain had exerted, at some point, enough force to deform quarter-inch steel. Clara crouched on the stone floor of the east room and looked at the bent links and felt her mind doing what it always did, organizing, cross-referencing, pulling from the ledger every entry she had made over months and placing it in relation to this new information. And she made herself stop. She made herself slow down. She made herself breathe. Not yet. Look at everything first, then think. The letter was on the floor in the far corner, half beneath the edge of the baseboard, as if it had been placed somewhere and slipped, or as if it had been read and set down with hands that weren't functioning carefully and had been forgotten. She picked it up. The handwriting was the older woman's, Dorian's aunt, she was almost certain, the measured, deliberate script of someone who wrote with precision and expected to be read with equal precision. The date at the top was 6 weeks ago. 3 weeks before the wedding. She read it once, quickly. Then she read it again. Dorian. The binding holds for now, but proximity intensifies the pull. You know this, and you know the studies bear it out without exception. The closer she is to you on a continuous basis, the stronger the instinct becomes. You know what happens if you lose control near a bonded mate. The consequences are not survivable for her and not forgivable for you. We are not asking you to end it. We are asking you to be honest. She is sharper than you have perhaps allowed yourself to fully acknowledge. She will find her way to the truth regardless of what you do or don't say. The only variable is whether she finds it from you or from the thing itself. Tell her what you are, or we will, before the next full moon. Clara read the last line 3 times. Tell her what you are. Not, tell her the truth. Not, tell her about the family history. Not any of the softer, more interpretable formulations available to a person with something to confess. Tell her what you are. She was still crouching on the stone floor. She became aware of this and stood up carefully, as if her body were a thing requiring management. She folded the letter along its original creases. She placed it back in the corner where she had found it, at the same angle, with the same edge beneath the baseboard. She looked at the room one more time. The walls, the chain, the bent links, the gray light from the north-facing window falling across all of it with the flat, democratic indifference of winter light that illuminates without warmth. She turned and walked out of the room and pulled the door to its original position, 4 inches open exactly, and continued down the corridor with the linen still in her arms. She made tea. It was the only thing she could identify to do with her body that would not require her to make decisions. She filled the kettle and put it on the stove and reached for the tea tin and measured leaves into the pot with movements that were precise and deliberate, because precision was the only thing standing between her and the alternative, which was to sit down on the kitchen floor and not get up. Her hands were shaking. Not violently, not the full-body trembling of acute shock, just a fine, continuous tremor, barely visible, fully present, that she could feel in her fingers and in the base of her wrists, and that would not stop regardless of how deliberately she breathed. She poured the water when it boiled. She watched the tea steep. She wrapped both hands around the cup when it was ready and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the back garden, the frost-hard ground, the bare trees at the back boundary, the pale January sky above all of it. And she let her mind do what it had been held back from doing since she walked out of that room. Sets of 5. the width of a spread hand, a chain rated for significant load, with links bent by something stronger. The binding holds for now. The closer she is to you, the stronger the pull becomes. Tell her what you are. She thought about the canceled plans mapped against the lunar calendar. She thought about his face at the tree line on their first evening walk, every muscle pulling taut, orienting toward the woodland with an attention that wasn't human. She thought about his reflexes, the 8 feet of cobblestone, the cart horse. She thought about his hands on the warmth of his skin. She thought about the way animals went quiet when he passed, not before a storm quiet, but the other kind, the low, listening kind. She thought about Isadora's grip on her wrist. A name given is a name bound. She was Clara Ashvale now. She drank her tea standing at the kitchen window, and her hands shook finely and continuously, and she thought, with the particular precision of a woman who notices small things and files them away and builds ledgers and waits until all the evidence is in before reaching conclusions, I have been building to this for months. I have known, below the level of language, for months, and I have been choosing deliberately to wait. And now the room has made waiting into something I no longer have the right to do. The question was not what he was. The question had passed through what and arrived at why. Why Harrow's Creek? Why her specifically? Why the vows he had written with their double-layered language and their careful confessions dressed as poetry? Why Sarah's hands on her arms at the wedding? Whatever else comes, things will come. And underneath all of it, underneath every question, was the one she was most afraid to examine. He loves me. I know he does. I have never been more certain of anything. So why does that make it worse? She heard the front door at 4:30, his footsteps in the hall. She knew the sound of them, had cataloged them without meaning to over weeks of shared living, the particular rhythm and weight of him moving through their house. She heard him set down whatever he was carrying. She heard the pause. The pause was longer than usual. She heard him walk to the kitchen doorway. She didn't turn around. She was still standing at the window, her tea long cold, her hands wrapped around the cup that was no longer giving her anything. Outside, the light had gone the flat gray of late afternoon, the garden shapeless and dim. She heard him standing in the doorway behind her. The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 15, long enough that it had its own shape, not awkward, not uncertain, but the silence of a man who is assessing a situation with complete attention and taking the time to do it accurately before he speaks. She knew, even before he said anything, that he knew. Not because she had left evidence. She had been careful. The door was exactly as she'd found it. The letter was in its corner. She had touched nothing that would show touching. He knew because of something she couldn't see or control, something that came from the same part of him that had moved 8 feet of cobblestone faster than human sight, that had stopped at the tree line with every muscle pulling taut, that had known to come to her garden the afternoon the wood store roof came down before she had called for anyone. He knew. He said, "How much did you read?" Clara turned around. She looked at his face, at the composed, careful, steady face of the man she loved, and at what was living underneath the composure now. Not fear, not anger, not the defensive reorganization of someone caught in a lie. Something rawer than any of those. Something that looked, stripped of everything else, almost like relief. Like a man who has been carrying a very heavy thing alone for a very long time and has just heard in 4 words that he no longer has to. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she set down her cold cup on the windowsill. "Enough," she said, and the word landed between them like the first stone into still water, and the ripples it made were going to reach every shore. Chapter 7. The First Truth and the Larger Lie. He didn't sit down. She noticed that. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on and his hands at his sides, and he looked at her across the small distance of the kitchen, her at the window, him at the threshold, and he did not move to close the space between them. Like he understood, without being told, that the space was something she needed right now, that coming closer before she'd given him permission would be a transgression she wasn't ready to forgive. That awareness, even now, even in this moment, was so completely him that it broke something open in her chest. She waited. He said, "What do you want me to start with?" Not, "Let me explain." Not, "It isn't what you think." Not the reflexive defensive repositioning of a person trying to manage someone else's reaction. Just that. Clean and direct. "What do you want me to start with?" Giving her the architecture of the conversation, putting the control in her hands. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Start with what you are," she said. He held her gaze. Something moved through his face, not flinching exactly, more like the expression of a man stepping off a ledge he has been standing at the edge of for a very long time. "I am a werewolf," he said. "My family carries the bloodline. It has been in us for as many generations as we have records for, and before that too, most likely." A pause. "The disappearances, the room, the chain, all of it is exactly what it looks like." The words landed in the kitchen like stones dropped into cold water. Clara watched them land. She felt the impact of each one, not as shock, because the shock had already happened, in that room on the stone floor, crouched beside a chain with bent links, but as a kind of settling. The violent reorganization of everything she had understood about her life, happening not as an explosion, but as a slow, grinding tectonic shift. The ground moving beneath her feet without drama, just moving, permanently, into a new configuration. She breathed. "The chain," she said, "for the full moon nights." His voice was level. He was watching her face with the focused attention of a man monitoring something critical, not intrusively, just present to whatever she needed. 3 nights a month. The shift is not, I don't lose myself entirely. It isn't like the stories. I know what I am, and I know where I am, and I retain most of myself. The slight hesitation on most was almost imperceptible. She caught it. But the instincts are amplified to a degree that makes proximity to people dangerous. The chain is a precaution. The room is a precaution. The canceled plans were... "The lunar calendar," Clara said. He stopped. She watched something move through him, surprise, she thought, and then a kind of painful recognition. "You mapped it." "The 4th, the 19th, the 21st. She said the dates flatly, without inflection. "Always the same window. I checked the almanac." He closed his eyes for one moment. When he opened them, the expression on his face was complex, layered in a way she didn't have a clean taxonomy for. Pride, she thought. Grief. The particular combination of a man confronted with evidence of exactly how well the person he loves knows him, at the worst possible moment to appreciate it. "Yes," he said simply. She looked at her hands, still wrapped around the cold cup which she was apparently still holding. She set it down on the windowsill. She looked back at him. "The reflexes," she said. "The cart horse." "Yes." "Your temperature. You run warmer than..." "Yes." "The woodland. The night we walked to the tree line and you..." "Clara." Her name in his voice, quiet and steady. "Yes, all of it. Whatever you noticed. Yes." She stood with that. The comprehensiveness of it. The fact that her ledger, every entry, every careful observation accumulated over months, was not paranoia or pattern-seeking, or the overactive noticing of a woman who needed to believe something was wrong. It was all real. All of it had been exactly what it appeared to be. She had been right about every single thing and had talked herself out of the conclusions anyway, because the love was real, and love had made her willing to stay uncertain. She felt, simultaneously, vindicated and devastated. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said, not as a question, as a statement that required a response. He moved then, not toward her, just shifted his weight, hands coming out of his pockets and hanging at his sides, open. "Because I was afraid," he said, "not of what you'd do, of what it would cost you to know. There is no version of this information that doesn't change everything. There is no way to hand someone this truth and have their life remain the same afterward." A beat. I kept thinking, 1 more week, 1 more month, when we're more solid, when the foundation is deeper, When I know you won't—" He stopped. "Won't what?" "Leave." The word fell between them and sat there, undefended. She looked at it. She looked at his face above it, stripped of composure now, fully stripped, nothing managed or calculated, just a man who was afraid in the specific way that people are afraid when the thing they love most is standing at a distance they can't close. She felt the love for him move through her like a tide. She also felt something else, something that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with what she was about to ask next. A coldness gathering at the base of her sternum, precise and specific, the physical sensation of a question whose answer she already knew and had not yet allowed herself to know. "Dorian," she said, "how did you find me?" The quality of the silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it. He told her, she would think about this later, about the fact that he told her without being broken down to it, without her having to pull it piece by piece. He simply looked at her face and understood that she had already reached the edge of the real question, and he told her. There was an arrangement. Older than either of them, older than Dorian's father, stretching back through generations of his bloodline's history with the families of certain towns. A bonded human mate, chosen freely and bound by name, had a stabilizing effect on a wolf's control. Not metaphorically, physically, chemically, in ways his family had documented over decades. The proximity of a bonded mate softened the amplification of instinct around the full moon, made the chain less necessary, made the room less necessary, made the man more fully himself and less at war with what ran in his blood. His family had identified Harrow's Creek through the arrangement's existing network. They had identified the Voss family specifically, and they had sent Dorian, not kidnapped, not coerced, genuinely sent, with his knowledge and his consent, to meet the candidate. "The candidate," Clara said. His jaw tightened fractionally. "That's the family's language, not mine." "But that's what I was." "That's what the arrangement called for. What I found when I got here was different." His voice was careful and precise. "I want to be clear about that. What I found when I got here changed everything about how I understood what I was doing." Clara looked at him. She believed him. She believed the love was real. She had never stopped believing that, even in the East Room, even on the kitchen floor with her hands shaking. The love was real, and she knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. But who in Harrow's Creek knew about the arrangement, she said. The pause was very short, half a breath. "The arrangement requires a family intermediary," he said. "Someone in the candidate's family who facilitates the introduction, who understands the context." Clara's chest went cold. "Which family?" she said, though she already knew. She had known since the word arrangement had left his mouth. She had known with the specific, terrible clarity of a woman whose ledger had just received its final entry and completed a picture she had been assembling for months without knowing the frame. Dorian looked at her. "Clara, which family?" Her voice was perfectly steady. That was the thing about real devastation. It didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrived as a kind of preternatural calm, the body's emergency system clearing everything unnecessary so the essential machinery could keep running. "Tell me which family." "The Voss family," he said quietly. "Your aunt was the intermediary." She didn't move. She stood at the kitchen window with the gray January dark pressing against the glass, and she let it arrive. All of it, the full weight and shape of it, without managing it, without the ledger's careful organization, without the protection of any analytical distance. Aunt Meredith had known before Dorian arrived, had known what he was, what the arrangement required, what a bonded mate meant in the specific biological mechanics of a werewolf bloodline, had sat across from Clara at the dinner table for months, through the courtship, through the proposal, through the wedding, and had known every single detail and had said nothing, had offered nothing, had let Clara walk into it with the careful neutrality of a woman who had decided that outcome management was the same thing as love. "Don't get ahead of yourself, dear. Men like that don't stay. Not warning. Calibration. Keeping Clara's expectations low enough that gratitude would override questions. But that wasn't the worst of it. Clara knew, standing at the window, that wasn't the bottom of it. Because there was one more question, and she needed to ask it, and she needed Dorian to tell her the truth, and she needed it now, before the coldness in her chest could become something she couldn't come back from. "Who was the original candidate?" she said. She heard him breathe. "The arrangement identifies candidates by family and by compatibility markers. The original candidate in the Voss family," he stopped. "Was Vivian," Clara said. The silence confirmed it before he spoke. "Yes," he said. "Vivian refused." "Yes. And Meredith offered me instead." The word "instead" hung in the cold kitchen air like something with physical weight, like a thing that had been living in the room for months, invisible, waiting for someone to finally give it its name. Instead. Not, "Clara is extraordinary and deserving and the right choice." Not, "Clara is the one who will love him truly and be loved truly in return." Not any version of chosen or seen or first. Instead. Because Vivian had said no, and there was another girl in the house who was, presumably, adequate to the purpose and unlikely to refuse anything that resembled being wanted. Clara had spent her whole life being almost enough. She had genuinely, with her whole heart, thought that Dorian had ended that he had been the correction, that she had finally been someone's first choice, their deliberate and specific choice, and that the choosing had been real. Sarah's voice at the wedding, "He chose you on purpose, not because you were available." But Sarah hadn't known, had she, that available was exactly why Clara had been put in Dorian's path in the first place, that the choosing had been real. His choosing, yes, she believed that. She would always believe that. But the presenting of her to be chosen had been the same transaction it had always been in her life. Here is the other one. She'll do. She felt it move through her. Not tears, not yet. Something beneath tears, something older and more structural. The specific grief of a woman who has been proved right about the worst thing she ever believed about herself. Almost enough. Always almost enough. She stood at the window and breathed. Behind her, Dorian hadn't moved. He was giving her the space. Still giving her the space, even now, even after everything. Because that was who he was. And the fact that he was still, even in this moment, exactly the man she loved was the most painful thing about all of it. When she finally turned, her face was composed. Not because she was performing composure, because she was Clara Voss, Clara Ashvale, and she had been managing devastating things quietly her entire life, and her body knew the shape of it. She looked at him. She said, "Did you know? When you came here, did you know Vivian had refused and I was the replacement?" He looked back at her and his eyes were clear and direct, and she could see in them the answer before he gave it. "Not at first," he said. "I was told there was a candidate in the Voss family. I wasn't given the full history of the selection process until..." He stopped. "Until after I had already met you." "And then?" "And then I didn't care," he said. "Because by then it wasn't the arrangement anymore. It was you. Specifically. Only." Clara looked at him. She believed him. She also knew that believing him and being undamaged by the truth were two completely separate things, and that one did not produce the other. "I need to think," she said. "I know. I'm not leaving. I need you to know that." She watched something loosen in him at those words, a fundamental tension releasing from his spine, his shoulders, the set of his jaw. "But I need to think. And I need to speak to Meredith." Something shifted in his expression at that. Not fear, exactly. More like a man watching something he has no power to stop and accepting that his powerlessness is deserved. "Clara." "Not tonight," she said. "Tomorrow." She walked past him out of the kitchen and up the stairs, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and she let herself feel every single thing she had been holding together with both hands since she pushed open the door in the east corridor. She felt it all. The love, the rage, the grief, the specific bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who had spent her entire life being managed by the people who were supposed to love her most, handed from one purpose to another like an item of convenient use. She felt it all, every particle of it in the dark, and then she straightened her spine, and she began, quietly and precisely, to decide what she was going to do about it. Vivian knew, Aunt Meredith knew, and they handed Clara over without a word. I need your reaction in the comments right now. Are you furious? Because you should be. Share this video. This betrayal deserves an audience. Chapter 8. The Final Confrontation. She slept. Not well, and not long, but she slept, which surprised her when she woke at 5 in the morning to the dark and the cold and the immediate comprehensive awareness of everything that had happened the night before arriving back in her chest like a tide coming in. She had expected to lie awake until dawn. Instead, her body had made an executive decision, the way bodies sometimes do when the mind has been working past its sustainable limit. It had simply switched off, briefly, to allow the essential machinery to reset. She lay in the dark and she took stock. Not of her feelings. She had done that last night, in the dark on the edge of the bed, with more thoroughness than she had ever applied to anything. The feelings were catalogued and filed and real, and still present and would remain present for a long time. She understood that. But feelings were not the same as decisions, and it was decisions that the morning required. She knew what she was going to do. She had known, somewhere underneath the grief and the rage and the exhaustion, since approximately the moment Dorian had said, "Your aunt was the intermediary." The knowing had been quiet and immediate and entirely certain, the specific quality of a conclusion that doesn't require deliberation because it has been building its case for years and is simply finally in possession of the last piece of evidence it needed. She was going to Meredith's house. She was going to do it today, before the resolve had time to develop the kind of hesitation that distance and complexity produce. She was going to do it clearly and without anger, because anger was a fuel that burned fast and left residue, and what this required was not heat, but precision. The cold, exact kind of precision she had been developing her entire life, quietly, without anyone noticing, in the process of surviving a childhood where she had been perpetually managed by someone who had confused management with love. She dressed before the house was light. Dorian was in the kitchen when she came downstairs. He had not slept. She could tell without asking, from the slight tension at the corners of his eyes and the particular quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of a man who had spent the night sitting with something difficult rather than the stillness of rest. He had made coffee. He was standing at the stove, with his hands wrapped around his cup in a mirror image of where she had stood the evening before, and he looked at her when she appeared in the doorway with an expression that was open and tired and very carefully not asking anything of her. She crossed the kitchen and poured coffee and stood beside him. They were quiet for a moment. "I'm going to Meredith's," she said. He said nothing for a beat. Then, "Do you want me to come?" "No." "All right." That was all. No argument, no concern dressed as protective instinct, no attempt to position himself between her and a difficult thing. Just, all right. Trusting her judgment about what she needed and what she was capable of, the way he had always trusted her judgment, and the fact that even now, even after everything, that quality in him was completely intact, made something in her chest ache with a complexity she didn't have a clean name for. She drank her coffee. She set down the cup. She put on her coat. At the door, she turned back once. He was watching her from the kitchen, still, warm, steady, and his face said everything it had always said when he looked at her, and nothing about the night before had changed it, and she held that for one moment before she walked out into the cold January morning. Meredith's house was 12 minutes from theirs on foot. Clara walked it in 11. The town was not yet fully awake. A few early risers, the baker's boy doing deliveries, smoke beginning to appear from chimneys as fires were stoked for the morning. The air was hard and clean, and the frost on the cobblestones made her footsteps sharp and precise, and she let the rhythm of them organize her. By the time she reached the familiar green door at the end of Sallow Lane, she was completely composed, and completely decided, and completely, irrevocably done with waiting. She knocked twice, not loudly. She was not here to perform. Vivian opened the door. This was not what Clara had planned for. She had anticipated Meredith, had built the opening of the conversation around Meredith, and for a fraction of a second, the surprise registered on her face before she managed it back to neutral. Vivian was in her morning dress, her hair not yet arranged, and she looked at Clara on the doorstep with an expression that moved through several things in rapid succession. Surprise, something that might have been guilt, and then the familiar reorganization into composure that Clara had watched her sister perform since childhood. "Clara," Vivian said. Not, "What are you doing here?" Not, "This is early." Just her name. Like she had been expecting this, in the abstract, for some time. "Is Meredith up?" Clara said. A pause. "She's in the sitting room." "Good," Clara said, and walked in. Meredith was in her chair by the window with her morning tea, exactly where she had been on 1,000 other mornings. Upright, composed, the particular picture of a woman who organized her presentation to the world as carefully as she organized everything else. She looked up when Clara entered, and her expression went through its own rapid sequence before settling into the careful neutral that Clara had been reading her whole life. "Clara," a slight pause, "you're early." "I know," Clara said. She did not sit down. She stood in the center of the sitting room with her coat still on and her hands still, and she looked at her aunt with clear, direct eyes, and she began. Not loudly. This was important. She had decided, walking the 11 minutes, that she would not raise her voice once. Not because she was suppressing anything, but because the truth, laid out plainly and without drama, was more devastating than anything volume could achieve, and Meredith deserved to hear it without the mercy of being able to dismiss it as emotion. "I know about the arrangement," she said. "I know about the bloodline and the bonded mate and what it requires. I know Dorian was sent here through a network that your family was part of. I know Vivian was the original candidate, and I know that when Vivian refused, you offered me in her place." She watched Meredith's face. The composure held for the first several seconds, the long practice of a woman who did not give ground easily. But underneath it, at the edges, something was shifting. The slight tightening around her eyes, the way her hands, wrapped around her teacup, adjusted their grip. "Clara, I'm not finished," Clara said, quietly, pleasantly almost. "I know you let me meet him without telling me what he was. I know you watched me fall in love with him and let me make vows to him and give him my name without telling me what that name meant in the context of this arrangement. I know you sat at my wedding and watched and said nothing." A pause. "I know all of it. I need you to understand that there is no partial version of this conversation available to us. I have all of it." The silence in the room was complete. Behind her, she heard Vivian come to stand in the doorway. She didn't turn around. Meredith set down her teacup. Her hands were steady, Clara granted her that. When she spoke, her voice was measured, and she was clearly reaching for the framing she had probably prepared against the possibility of exactly this conversation. "What I did for you," Meredith said. "You need to understand that. I understand that's how you've chosen to see it. Dorian is a good man. His family is not the point," Clara said. "The point is that I was not given the information I needed to make my own choice. The point is that you and Vivian, between you, decided what was available to me and what I was capable of handling and what I deserved to know. And you made those decisions without my knowledge or my consent, and you dressed it up as care." Something shifted in Meredith's face. The composure was cracking now, Not dramatically, not with tears or raised voices, but with the specific quality of a structure under load that has found its limit. She lifted her chin slightly, and Clara recognized the gesture, had seen it her whole life, the particular configuration of a woman who is about to say the most honest thing she has ever said and is going to defend it anyway. "You were never going to get a love match, Clara." The words were measured and deliberate and entirely without cruelty in Meredith's voice, which somehow made them worse. "Not here, not in this town. You were quiet and overlooked, and the men who came through Harrow's Creek were not looking for what you had to offer. I knew that. I had known it for years." A pause. "What the arrangement offered was a man who would value you, who would choose you and stay, who would see you clearly and love what he saw. I gave you the best offer you were ever going to receive." The room held its breath. Clara looked at her aunt, at this woman who had fed her and housed her and kept her safe for 13 years, and had understood none of the essential things about her in all that time, and she felt, beneath the rage and the grief, a clarity so complete it was almost peaceful. She let the silence hold for one full breath. Then she said, "You didn't give me anything." Her voice was quiet, surgical, each word placed with the precision of someone who has been building to this their entire life and is finally, at last, in possession of everything they need to say it properly. "You traded me. There is a difference. Giving would have required my knowledge, my participation, my choice, my name on the decision. What you did was a transaction conducted entirely between other parties, about my life, without me in the room." She held her aunt's gaze without blinking. "You decided I wasn't capable of making my own choices. You decided that managing my life was the same thing as caring about it, and you have been making that decision, in smaller ways and larger ones, since I was 9 years old." Meredith opened her mouth. "I'm not finished," Clara said again, still quietly, still without heat. "Dorian chose to stay, after everything, after the room, after the letter, after I found out all of it. He stayed. And now I am choosing to decide what that means, on my own terms, with full information, the way I should have been allowed to decide from the beginning." A pause that had the weight of everything that had come before it. "You don't get a seat at that table anymore." The words landed and sat. Meredith looked at her niece, this woman she had raised and managed and underestimated with the best intentions and the least insight, and for the first time in Clara's memory, she had nothing to say. The composure had not shattered. It was still there, holding, because Meredith was not a woman who shattered, but it had gone very, very still, like a lake after a stone has been dropped into it, the surface apparently calm, but everything underneath rearranged. Clara turned. Vivian was in the doorway exactly where Clara had known she would be, still. Her face was not the face Clara had expected, not the dismissive composure of a woman who considered herself above the proceedings, not the quick, hot flash of the Vivian who always had a response to everything. She looked small. That was the only word for it. In the frame of the doorway, in her morning dress, with her hair unfinished, and her hands at her sides, and her face doing something complicated and private, Vivian, who had commanded every room she had ever entered without trying, looked small, like a woman who has watched something unfold and understood, for the first time, what her part in it actually cost. She didn't speak. Clara looked at her for one moment, not with anger, not with triumph, because neither of those was what she felt. What she felt was something older and sadder than both. The specific grief of two people who shared blood and had never, in all their years of shared living, managed to find their way to each other. "Goodbye, Vivian," she said. She walked out of the house. The walk home was different from the walk there. Not lighter exactly. She was not a woman who confused resolution with relief, and she understood clearly that the conversation she had just had would leave marks that didn't heal cleanly, and that some losses don't stop being losses just because they were necessary. Meredith was not a villain. That was the complicated truth Clara carried with her through the frost-sharp morning air. Meredith was a woman who had loved her badly, with the tools available to her, according to her own limited understanding of what Clara needed and deserved. The damage was real. The intention had not been malicious. Both of those things could be true simultaneously. Clara had learned, over 22 years, to hold two true things at once. Dorian was in the sitting room when she got back, not pacing, sitting, on the edge of the chair nearest the window, coat on, as if he had put it on some time ago, and then decided against whatever he had been preparing to do, and sat back down. He looked up when she came in, and the expression on his face was the most honest thing she had ever seen on a human face. It was a man who had already accepted the worst possible outcome and was sitting quietly inside that acceptance and waiting. On the table beside him was a folded piece of paper. She looked at it. He saw her looking. "It's a letter to my uncle," he said, "formally withdrawing from the arrangement, releasing you from the binding." A pause. "It can be undone. The name binding. Isadora was right that it's real, but she was wrong that it's permanent. It can be dissolved." He looked at her steadily. "I drafted it this morning. It needs only my signature." Clara looked at the letter. "The full moon is 3 days away," he said. "I should leave before then regardless. I'll go to my family's house in the north. I can manage it there. I've done it for years without a bonded mate. It's harder, but it's—" He stopped, reorganized. "What I'm trying to say is that my management of my own condition is not your responsibility. It never should have been framed that way. The arrangement made it sound like you were necessary for my stability, and that framing put an obligation on you that you didn't agree to, and I—" He stopped again. He looked at his hands. "You don't owe me forgiveness," he said quietly. "You don't owe me anything. Not after what I kept from you. Not after what your family did. You walked into this with half the information and someone else's hands on the doors, and you deserved better than that from the beginning." The room was very still. Clara stood in the doorway with her coat on, and she looked at this man, this complicated, extraordinary, deeply honest man who had just drafted his own exit to give her freedom she hadn't asked for. And she felt the love for him with a clarity that the last 24 hours had not diminished, but had somehow made more specific, more precise, stripped of every comfortable assumption down to its actual structure, which was solid. She looked at him for a long time. He waited, the way he had always waited, without pressure, without performance, giving her the full space of her own mind to work in. Then she said, "I know." He looked up. "I know I don't owe you anything," she said. "That's why it matters that I'm staying." Something moved through his face that she had no word for. It was not relief. Relief was too small, too simple. It was more like a man who has been braced against a weight for so long that when it finally lifts, the absence of it is almost as difficult to process as the thing itself. He stood. She crossed the room, and when he put his arms around her, she felt the warmth of him, that always slightly more than ordinary warmth, and the steady weight of him, and the heartbeat that was deep and slow and even, and she pressed her face into his shoulder, and she let herself be held. Not because she was fragile, not because the storm had passed and safety was restored, because she had chosen this, with full information, with open eyes, with every door in the house standing open, and every secret on the table, and every illusion stripped away. She had looked at all of it, and she had chosen him anyway. That was not the same as the choosing she had done in the December meadow. That had been the choosing of a woman in love. This was something harder and more durable and more real than love alone. This was the choosing of a woman who knew exactly what she was holding and had decided it was worth the wait. Chapter 9. She knew everything. She stayed anyway. The 3 days before the full moon were the quietest days of Clara's marriage so far. Not uncomfortably quiet, not the silence of two people navigating damage or performing normalcy over a fault line. It was the quiet of two people who had said everything that needed saying and were now simply living inside the aftermath of that honesty. Carefully, with full awareness of what the honesty had cost and what it had built, moving through their shared space with the particular tenderness of people who understand, now, exactly what they are to each other, and what that understanding required to reach. Dorian did not pretend the full moon wasn't coming. That was new, or rather, it was the absence of something old, the removal of the careful deflection and the vague excuses, and the deliberate misdirection that had been the architecture of his management of this part of himself before she knew. There was no management now. He simply told her, the morning after she came home from Meredith's house, in plain and direct language. In 3 days, the moon would be full, the shift would come, and he would need the East Room and the chain and the 3 nights that followed. He told her what it looked like. He told her what it felt like from the inside, the way the instincts amplified in the days leading up to it, like a volume being turned slowly upward, everything sharper and more immediate and less mediated by the rational, linguistic part of his mind. He told her that he would know her. That was important, and he said it twice. He would know her, would always know her. The bond meant her scent and her presence were categorically distinct from everything the wolf considered a threat. But his control of himself in the wolf state was not absolute, and proximity during the shift was still dangerous, and he needed her to stay out of the East Wing for those 3 nights. He told her all of it at the kitchen table over coffee, in the same voice he used to talk about river systems and trade routes, and the agricultural manuals nobody borrowed from the library. Clara listened to everything. Then she said, "I understand. I'll stay out of the East Wing." He looked at her as if waiting for more, for fear, for conditions, for the moment when the reality of what she had agreed to finally arrived and renegotiated the terms. She picked up her coffee cup. "What do you want for dinner?" she said. Something in his face shifted, quietly, fundamentally. The expression of a man who has been waiting, his entire adult life, for the other shoe to drop, and is beginning, slowly, cautiously, with the specific care of someone who has been disappointed by hope before, to consider the possibility that there is no other shoe. She thought about Meredith in the days that followed. Not obsessively, not with the circular grinding quality of unresolved anger. She had said what needed saying and it had been received, and the account between them was not closed, but it was at least honest now in a way it had never been before. She thought about her aunt the way you think about a wound that has been properly cleaned and dressed, aware of it, tending it, not pretending it wasn't there. What she kept returning to was not the betrayal itself, but the architecture underneath it. The assumption that had made the betrayal possible, the deep, unexamined, apparently unshakable belief that Clara's worth was a fixed and modest quantity, that her ceiling had been assessed and found low, that the kindest thing anyone could do for her was manage her outcomes carefully so she didn't bruise herself reaching for things she couldn't have. Meredith had loved her. Clara had never doubted that. But Meredith had loved her the way people love things they have already decided the value of, protectively, carefully, with the specific blindness of someone who has made up their mind and is no longer actually looking. Nobody had asked Clara what she was worth. Nobody had asked Clara what she wanted, what she was capable of, what she might become if given the full information and the unmanaged space to make her own choices. Nobody except Dorian. And the particular, devastating irony was that Dorian, who had arrived in her life through an arrangement, through a network, through the machinations of other people making decisions about her without her knowledge, had been the first person to treat her like someone whose judgment could be trusted completely, who had given her the space of her own mind, who had, even in his withholding, never once condescended to her, had simply been afraid, which was a different thing, a human thing, a thing she understood. She thought about what it meant that the man sent to find her had found something nobody was looking for. She thought about Sarah's hands on her arms at the wedding. He chose you on purpose. And she thought, yes, he did. Not because I was available. Not because Vivian had said no and I was adequate to the purpose. He came here because of the arrangement, and he stayed because of me. And the difference between those two things is the distance between a transaction and a life. She was not the consolation prize. She had never been the consolation prize. She had simply been surrounded her entire life by people who could not see the difference between a woman who was quiet and a woman who was waiting. She was done waiting. The news from Meredith's house reached her not through direct communication. Meredith did not come, did not write, and Clara did not expect her to, not yet, not for some time, but through the ordinary channels of Harrows Creek's social ecosystem, which were as reliable as ever. Vivian's engagement to Thomas Aldridge had been quietly, mutually dissolved. Clara heard it from Mrs. Orville, who had heard it from the butcher's wife, who had apparently heard it directly from Thomas's mother, with the stunned delivery of a woman who had not seen it coming. The official explanation was vague: incompatibility, a mutual recognition that the match was not right, all the language that polite society uses to cover the things it cannot say out loud. Clara thought about Vivian's face in Meredith's doorway, that small, private, complicated expression, the look of a woman who has watched her sister do something she herself was not brave enough to do, and has understood, perhaps for the first time, what her cowardice actually cost her. Vivian had refused the arrangement out of vanity, or fear, or the specific pride of a woman who had always been the first choice and could not process being assigned rather than pursued. And in refusing it, she had handed Clara something she had dismissed as beneath her, and Clara had taken that thing and looked at it clearly and chosen it with her whole self. And now, Vivian was sitting in Meredith's house on Sallow Lane with a dissolved engagement and a face that had gone small in a doorway, and Clara was here. Clara was here. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to, had half anticipated the specific satisfaction of a long-running injustice finally correcting itself. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complete. Not triumph over Vivian, simply the solid, settled feeling of a woman who is standing on ground she chose herself, in a life she has claimed on her own terms, and who no longer needs the comparison to know her own worth. She had been almost enough her entire life. She was done with almost. The full moon came on a Thursday. The day before it, Dorian was quieter than usual. Not distant. He was still present, still himself, still the man who noticed what she needed and gave it to her without being asked. But there was a quality to his stillness that was different from his ordinary contained quiet. Something underneath it was closer to the surface. His jaw was set. His movements through the house were slightly more deliberate, slightly more careful, the way a person moves when they are paying active attention to their own body. At dinner, he barely ate. She didn't comment on it. She simply refilled his water glass and asked him about the letter he'd been writing to his uncle. Not the dissolution letter, which had gone unsigned and remained on the table where he'd left it, because she had told him plainly that she did not want the binding dissolved, and he had looked at her for a long moment, and then folded the letter and set it aside. A different letter, this one. Correspondence about family business, the ordinary mechanics of a life that extended beyond Harrows Creek. He answered her questions, and the conversation moved, and she watched him throughout, managing himself with a quiet effort that he was not hiding from her anymore, and was not performing for her either. Just living honestly inside what he was, in front of her, without the locked doors. "I'll go to the East Room after dinner," he said when the plates were cleared. "I'd rather do it early than wait until—" He didn't finish the sentence. "I know," she said. He stood. He carried his plate to the sink. He stood at the sink for a moment with his back to her, and she could see in the set of his shoulders, in the slight bowing of his head, the weight of what the next 3 nights required him to be. Alone, chained, reduced to something he spent the rest of his life carefully containing. She crossed the kitchen. She put her hand between his shoulder blades, flat, steady, just her palm against his back. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the touch didn't say better. She felt him breathe, felt the breath go all the way down, felt the shoulders drop a fraction, felt the specific physical release of a man who has been holding himself together with considerable effort and has just been given permission to put some of that effort down. He turned. He looked at her face for a long moment. "I'll be all right," he said. "I always am." "I know," she said. I'll be here when you come back." Something in his expression, in those deep-set dark eyes that she had been reading for months, that she could now read with the fluency of someone who had learned a language from the inside, shifted into something she had not seen there before. Not relief, not gratitude, something deeper than both. The specific expression of a person who has spent years believing, at the most fundamental level, that the full truth of what they are is incompatible with being loved, and is confronting, for the first time, the possibility that they were wrong. He went upstairs. She heard the east corridor door close. She heard the lock. She sat down at the kitchen table with a book she did not read for the next 2 hours, and she listened to the house, and she stayed. She sat on the porch steps at midnight, not because she had been told to, not because she had planned it. She had woken at 11, some internal mechanism, some alertness she hadn't had before this week, and she had lain in bed for 40 minutes and then gotten up, put on her warmest coat and her boots, and the thick wool scarf she kept on the hook by the door, and she had gone outside and sat down on the stone steps. The moon was enormous. She had known, intellectually, that a full moon in January was a specific and remarkable thing. The light it threw was not the pale suggestion of other months, but something with actual presence, actual weight, a cold, silver illumination that turned the garden and the frost and the bare trees into a landscape from a different world. She had known this. She had not been prepared for it. She sat on the steps and looked at the moon, and she listened. From somewhere in the east wing, muffled by stone walls and a locked door, and the thickness of a house that had been built to last, she heard him. Not human, not the sounds a man made. Something older than language, deeper than pain, with a resonance that she felt in her sternum rather than her ears. Not a howl, not the dramatized version from stories, something more interior than that, more honest. The sound of a living thing at the full extent of what it was, stripped of everything it spent the rest of its time managing. Clara sat on the stone steps in the January moonlight and listened. She did not run. She did not cover her ears or go back inside or comfort herself with rationalizations. She simply sat with it, with the reality of it, the full, undramatized truth of what lived in the man she had married, what ran in his blood, what he locked behind a door and chained to a floor 3 nights a month for the sake of everyone around him. She sat with it until her breath steadied, and then she sat some more, because this was what staying meant. Not the easy version, not the staying of sunlit mornings and shared coffee and conversations about river systems. The staying that happened in the dark, on stone steps, in the cold, when the sound coming through the walls was nothing she could make comfortable or ordinary. This was the test. Not of love. She had always loved him. Of choice. And she was choosing. He came back at dawn. She heard the east corridor door, heard his footsteps on the stairs, heavier than usual, slower, the gait of a body that had been through something enormous and was reassembling itself in the aftermath. She heard him stop at the back door. She heard the door open. She stood up from the steps and turned. He was standing in the doorway in the gray, pre-dawn light, his shirt torn at one shoulder, his feet bare on the cold stone of the threshold, his hair disheveled and his face— God, his face. He looked like a man who had fought something all night and won, and was not sure the winning was worth it. Pale, hollowed out. His eyes, when they found her, carried a devastation that had nothing to do with the shift, and everything to do with the fact that she was still there, that she had stayed, that she was standing on the frost-covered porch steps, looking back at him with clear, steady eyes. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot believe is real. She went inside. She took the blanket from the chest in the hall, the thick one, the heaviest one, and she came back and she put it around his shoulders, and then she went to the kitchen and poured the tea that she had made before she came outside and left in the pot to stay warm, and she brought it to him. She wrapped his hands around the cup. She said nothing. There were no words that belonged in this moment, no reassurances, no carefully constructed sentences, no performance of equanimity. Just, The blanket and the tea and her presence and the January dawn coming up gray and clean over Harrow's Creek, and the two of them standing at the threshold of their house in the early light. He looked down at the cup in his hands, he looked up at her face, and something in him, the last held thing, the deepest locked door, the one she suspected he had not opened for anyone possibly ever, came quietly, finally, undone. She put her arms around him, blanket and all, and held on. He bent his head over hers and he held her back, and the tea went cold between them, and neither of them moved for a very long time. She married a werewolf without knowing. Let that sit for a moment. She walked down the aisle of the old stone chapel in the candlelight and gave her name and her life to a man whose full truth she did not have, and the world gave her no warning that would stick, no sign she was willing to read, no voice loud enough to cut through the specific deafness of a woman who has finally, after 22 years of almost, been chosen. She married him without knowing, but she stayed with him knowing everything, knowing about the East Room, knowing about the chain and the bent links and the letter and the arrangement, and the fact that she had been offered up as a substitute by the woman who raised her, knowing what lived in his blood and what it sounded like through stone walls at midnight, knowing the full weight and shape and cost of what she was choosing. She stayed. And that, not the moonlight, not the magic, not the curse, is the most extraordinary thing in this story. She stayed. Knowing everything, she stayed. Tell me in the comments, would you have stayed? And subscribe right now if you haven't, because the next story in this series is going to hit even harder than this one. Hit the bell. You don't want to miss it. I want to talk about what this story is actually about. Because on the surface, yes, werewolf, full moon, secret bloodline, all of it. And if that's what you came for, I hope it delivered. But underneath all of that, this is a story about something that has nothing to do with the supernatural. It's about what happens when the people in your life decide your worth before you've had a chance to demonstrate it. When someone looks at you and makes a calculation, quiet, private, never spoken out loud, and the calculation comes back low, and every decision they make about your life from that point forward is built on that number. Meredith was not a monster. That's the thing I keep coming back to. She was a woman who loved Clara with the ceiling she had assigned her. And the ceiling was the problem, not the love. The love was real. But love with a low ceiling is its own kind of cage, and it is one of the most common cages in the world, and most of the people inside it don't even know the bars are there because the bars are made of care. And then there's the question of being chosen. Clara thought she had finally been chosen first, and then she found out the choosing had been arranged by other people's hands, and the bottom dropped out. But here is the thing, and this is what I think Clara understood on that porch in the January moonlight, listening through stone walls to the truth of who her husband was. Being chosen first is not the same as being chosen truly. Dorian came to Harrow's Creek through an arrangement. He found Clara through a network of decisions she had no part in, and then he looked at her. Actually looked with full attention, with his whole self, and he chose her. Not as a candidate, not as a substitute, not as a function, as her. That choosing was real, and she decided it was enough. Not because she was settling, because she understood that the origin of an opportunity is not the same as the value of what you build with it. We are all, in some way, placed in front of things by hands other than our own. By circumstance, by accident, by other people's decisions made without our input. The question is never really how we got to the door. It's whether we walk through it with our eyes open. Clara walked through hers, and on the other side she found a life she had chosen, with full information, with open eyes, without anyone's hands on the doors. That is what it means to own your own story. That is what it means to be your own first choice.